The Airbus A320 sliced through the sky at 32,000 feet, its red and white fuselage gleaming under the muted glow of an overcast morning. Inside, 155 passengers and 7 crew members settled into their seats, their voices a murmur beneath the hum of the engines. Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501 had departed Surabaya, bound for Singapore, its path taking it over the vast Java Sea. In the cockpit, Captain Irianto adjusted his seat, his experienced hands resting on the controls. Beside him, First Officer Remy. Plessel monitored the instruments, his sharp eyes flicking between screens. A wall of dark cumulonimbus clouds loomed ahead, their thunderous forms shifting like restless titans. "We've got a growing cell at our 12 o'clock, Remy said, tapping the radar display. "That storm is stretching high. We might need to adjust." Captain Irianto exhaled slowly. He was no stranger to tropical weather, but today's formation looked particularly menacing. He reached for the radio. "Jakarta Center, this is QZ 8501, requesting climb to FL 380 due to weather." The reply crackled through the headset. "QZ 8501, unable due to traffic." The captain frowned. They would have to navigate around the worst of it. The storm wasn't going away. It was alive, a swirling monster of cold and heat, unpredictable in its fury. An ominous shift. The aircraft began encountering turbulence, the occasional bump shaking the cabin. Flight attendants reassured passengers with practiced smiles, moving swiftly to secure loose items. In the cockpit, an alarm chirped, a minor system advisory. The electronic centralized aircraft monitoring (ECAM) screen flickered, signaling a rudder travel limiter fault. A momentary hiccup, but nothing alarming. Irianto acknowledged the alert and made a mental note to report it upon landing. The turbulence intensified. Rain lashed against the windscreen. Updrafts twisted and yanked at the plane, jolting it with violent force. "We're getting some serious convective activity," Remy muttered, gripping the side stick. "Feels like wind shear." Suddenly, another warning appeared. The flight augmentation computer was registering a fault. Then another. The aircraft's autopilot disengaged with a harsh chime. "Autopilot off," Irianto announced, his voice calm but firm. He took manual control. "We're flying it raw. Keep an eye on the instruments." But the instruments were feeding them chaos. The flight computers flickered with inconsistent data, likely scrambled by the extreme weather conditions. The aircraft's angle of attack, AOA readings began fluctuating, the sensors struggling against the turbulence. Then, "Stall! Stall!" The synthetic voice of the warning system blared through the cockpit. The nose was pitching up. "Nose down," Remy called out. Irianto pushed forward on the side stick. But the plane wasn't responding as expected. The inputs felt sluggish, as though the aircraft itself was resisting correction. Their altitude was dropping, fast, plunging into chaos. The Airbus A320 fell into a rapid descent. The ground proximity warning system erupted with automated calls. "Terrain! Terrain! Pull up! Pull up!" Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as gravity shifted violently. The plane was tilting, nearly rolling over, its nose sinking at an impossible angle. Overhead, compartments burst open, belongings cascading into the air like weightless debris. "What's happening?" a woman cried, clutching her child. Flight attendants braced against the walls, their faces stretched in panic as they shouted instructions. In the cockpit, Irianto and Remy wrestled with the controls. The artificial horizon display showed a dizzying plummet, 12,000 feet per minute. Their altitude was bleeding away. "We need to stabilize." Remy gritted his teeth, his hands gripping. "The side stick. I'm trying." "The controls are—" Irianto paused, realization dawning. "The flight computers are fighting back. It's locked in a nose-up command." Remy's heart pounded. If the plane thought it was in a stall, It was refusing their input. The sensors were. "They wrong! Kill the computers!" Remy shouted. "Let's fly this manually." Irianto flipped the circuit breakers, isolating the flight augmentation system. The plane jolted, responding freely for the first time in minutes. He pushed the nose down, but their speed had already skyrocketed. The Java Sea was rising to meet them. Come on, Irianto murmured, hands shaking with exertion. The aircraft shuddered violently as it reached critical speeds. Panels ripped from the fuselage, air roaring through widening gaps. The final altimeter reading flashed, 4,000 feet. Then, the silence below. A deafening explosion tore through the sky as Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501 met the waters of the Java Sea. The force of impact shattered the aircraft, sending fragments spiraling into the deep. The ocean, indifferent to tragedy, swallowed the wreckage in minutes. Above, the storm rumbled, its dark clouds shifting once more. The echoes of the aircraft's last moments faded, lost beneath the waves. Darkness swallowed the shattered remains of Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501. Fragments of metal and luggage spiraled downward, disappearing into the yawning depths of the Java Sea. For a moment, the ocean stilled, its surface disrupted only by debris bobbing aimlessly, an eerie silence replacing the chaos of the fall. Then, from the void below, a muffled groan of metal under pressure echoed through the deep. A section of the fuselage, half intact, drifted downward, carrying within it remnants of what had once been a thriving, beating mass of humanity. Twisted cables swayed like lifeless tendrils, and loose oxygen masks floated aimlessly, detached from their purpose. The cabin was an underwater tomb, shadows creeping into every crevice as it sank further into the abyss. Somewhere within that wreckage, a faint movement disturbed the stillness. A survivor's awakening. Rahmat Darmawan coughed violently, choking on the salt water that had flooded his lungs. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, but he was alive. Panic surged through his veins as he gasped, instinctively clawing at his seatbelt. The cabin was eerily silent, the weight of the ocean pressing against its fragile remains. His mind reeled, trying to grasp reality. One moment, he had been clutching the armrests, praying as the plane spiraled toward the sea. The next, cold darkness had embraced him, swallowing his world whole. But he was here. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived the impact. The realization sent a new wave of urgency through his limbs. He struggled against the seatbelt, twisting his body until the latch finally gave way. Weightlessness fought against him, the water around him thick and sluggish. Air bubbles streamed past his face, racing toward the surface. He needed to follow them, needed to find a way out, but he wasn't alone. A weak, gurgling sound drew his attention. Just a few feet away, a child's small figure was still strapped to a seat, motionless. Rahmat's heart clenched. Without thinking, he kicked toward the child, his movements slow against the thick water. He reached out, gripping the seat and fumbling with the buckle. It was jammed. No, he muttered, ignoring the stinging salt in his eyes. With a sharp yank, the latch finally released, and the child, no older than 5, floated limply toward him. A girl, her tiny fingers still clutching a stuffed bear. Rahmat wrapped an arm around her, pushing upward with all his strength. His lungs burned, screaming for air. His ears rang with pressure. The wreckage above them was shifting, groaning as it was claimed by the depths. He kicked harder, his vision darkening at the edges. Then, finally, the surface. Rahmat broke through. With a ragged gasp, his arms tightening around the child. Salt water stung his nose and throat as he coughed violently, sucking in desperate gulps of air. All around him, the remains of the flight bobbed and drifted. The girl in his arms didn't move. Come on, he whispered frantically, tilting her head back. He pressed his lips to hers, breathing air into her lungs. 1 breath. 2. 3. Then a shudder, a weak cough. The girl sputtered, her tiny chest heaving as she gasped awake, her eyes wide with terror. "You're okay," Ramat whispered. "You're okay." A desperate search. The Java. Sea stretched endlessly around them, its surface an expanse of indifferent blue. Wreckage dotted the water. Seats, broken trays, torn suitcases. Here and there, other figures floated, some moving, others still. The cries of survivors rang out, desperate and fractured by the waves. Ramat held the child close, scanning the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray sky heavy with sorrow. Where were the rescue teams? Had a distress signal been sent before the crash? His mind spun with questions, but he forced himself to focus. A piece of the fuselage drifted nearby, one of the emergency exit doors still intact. With labored strokes, he pushed toward it, the child clinging weakly to his shirt. He reached the floating panel, pulling both of them onto it. It barely held their weight, dipping dangerously close to the waterline, but it was something. Help! A voice, weak and desperate, cut through the quiet. Ramat twisted, spotting a man struggling. A few meters away. His movements were sluggish, his face pale. Without hesitation, Rahmat slid back into the water, pushing toward him. The man was barely conscious, his strength fading fast. "I've got you," Rahmat grunted, gripping his arm and pulling him toward the makeshift raft. With effort, he helped him onto it, the added weight forcing them to adjust their balance. The man coughed, blinking weakly. "Thank you," he rasped. Ramat simply nodded. He looked down at the child who had curled against his side, her small frame shivering. He pulled off his soaked jacket, wrapping it around her frail body. "What's your name?" he asked gently. He hesitated before whispering, "Maya." "You're very brave, Maya," he said softly. "I need you to be strong a little longer, okay?" She nodded weakly, her fingers tightening around the sodden bear in her grasp. Hope on the horizon. Time stretched into an agonizing eternity. The sun rose higher, its warmth doing little to ease the chill in their bones. The survivors clung to whatever they could, their eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for salvation. Then a distant rumble. Ramat's heart leaped. He turned sharply, squinting against the glare of the sun. There, on the horizon, a speck, growing larger, the distinct shape of a helicopter. "Over here," he shouted, his voice raw. Others joined in, their cries echoing across the sea. The helicopter veered toward them, and soon a speedboat followed, cutting through the water with urgent precision. Rescue had come. As hands reached down to pull them aboard, Ramat felt his body finally relax, the tension of survival slipping away. He held Maya close as they were lifted from the wreckage-strewn sea, her small fingers still gripping his hand. They were alive, but the echoes of Flight 8501 would never leave them. Epilogue. Days later, Ramat stood on the shore, watching as pieces of the aircraft were recovered from the deep. The weight of loss hung heavy in the air, an unspoken grief shared by all who had survived. He looked down at Maya, who stood beside him, her small fingers still curled around his. She looked up at him, eyes filled with quiet understanding, far beyond her years. "We made it," she whispered. Ramat nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, we did." But in the vast, endless sea, the ghosts of the fallen still whispered, their final moments forever etched into the currents of time.